Well, hello.
Hi.
Could you please introduce yourself and your connection to Extinction Rebellion?
Right. Well, my name's Andrew Mottram. I live in Herefordshire. I'm on the older demographic of XR. I'm 66. You know, a lot of people think it's young people, but there's a whole huge range of people. I worked for a long time as an Anglican parish priest. I was a vicar for many years. And then I went into looking after old buildings. And when I retired last year, I was sort of wondering partly what to do. I've always known that this climate issue was there. I used to work in the 70s before I went to university as a market gardener, and we were aware that the climate was changing back then. We didn't know the size of the enormity of the problem, but we were aware. And so I then sort of had time to actually get my head around this. And in sort of end of last year, end of 2018, I've been reading about XR in the paper, and I'd also sort of just reached the point I thought I've got to do something. And so I went to an XR meeting and realised that, yeah, there is something I can do, which is to A, get serious about the climate crisis, which it really is, and B, I think for me particularly, is to get the message out across the society. Because at the moment XR, Boris Johnson dismissed it rudely as a bunch of crusties. Well, I'm not a crusty and a lot aren't crusties, but it is in a particular demographic and we've got to get the message much further. Yeah, so that's why I'm joining, why I'm active.
Okay. And so from there, can you briefly describe what the aim is of Extinction Rebellion?
Right. Well, it's threefold. Firstly, wherever it is, in this country or across the world, it is to get the government of the country to actually acknowledge and tell the people of their country that there is a climate crisis which is of enormous proportion. Because at the moment, governments are fudging it and they're not admitting to it. So that's one thing, that's the first aim. The second is to attempt to have a carbon zero lifestyle for the country by 2025. Now that is an enormous change.
Yeah.
That means a massive disinvestment from burning fossil fuels and a huge investment in renewable energy systems and also consuming less energy. So there's a huge lifestyle shift there. And then the third demand of XR is a way of bringing this about through citizens' assemblies, because at the moment government legislation across the world hasn't done anything to change the problems. From the first intergovernmental meeting of the Climate Change Committee of the UN back in 1990 to the Paris meeting, 2 years ago, nothing. We're burning more fossil fuels than ever before, and we're emitting more CO2 than ever before. So we've got to change the way we do things. One of the suggestions, or suggestion that's being taken seriously by XR, is citizens' assemblies. So we get people across the demographic of the country to engage in A, understanding the problem, and B, seeing if we can find ways to get out of the problem and the crisis towards which we are hurtling. And citizens' assemblies are about empowering a local democracy. How it works out, I think at the moment, does it shape government legislation? I don't know. Does it actually have legislative authority? I don't know. But at least we've got to have systems where people are talking about it and are taken seriously talking about it, rather than being put in the nutters camp, which is where at the moment, until very recently, anybody talking about climate change has been placed in the nutters camp.
Yeah. Actually, I'll have a few follow-up questions for that
That's
a bit
fine.
later, actually, because I think there's a lot to pull from there. But I thought I'd ask, while we're still at the aim and the kind of introduction to Extinction Rebellion, how is Extinction Rebellion organised? You say it's quite decentralised.
It is very decentralised, and I think organised is a word that doesn't come easily to Extinction
Yeah, that's
Rebellion.
very true, yeah.
It's
how are decisions made?
It's a very flat structure. So there are regional groups and area groups, often grouped by people being in a proximity. It could be a geographical proximity, it could be for instance, like a university proximity to each other, or it could be a profession or a trade or a business or something that they do, XR scientists, XR teachers, it's something that holds them together. So they're people who are committed to the cause of Extinction Rebellion, and they will be in an affinity group, it's called. And then you'll have a sort of regional group which will act as the coordinating body. But it's not a hierarchical group. It's not saying we're making the decisions and you do what we're told. It's not like that. People have ideas and suggestions, and they'll feed them into their affinity group, they'll feed them into their regional group, and some people say, yeah, it's a great idea, let's do it, and they'll do it. So there isn't a lot of organisation. I'm part of the Talks group, which is organised across West Midlands by a guy who sits in his office or in his house in Shropshire. And he rings me up and says, could I come and do a talk there? Could I go and do a talk here? So there's not a lot of organisation. What there is a commitment to get the climate crisis message across, a commitment to seek to adopt a lifestyle which is more in sympathy with the needs of the planet as it is now, and is definitely a commitment to non-violence. That if we make an action, we do not resort to violence. I would put breaking things and smashing stuff up in that. We do not do that.
Actually, could you elaborate more on that point of non-violence protest theory and how it can be effective as well?
Yeah, non-violent protest. I mean, it's, the XR says that Gandhi in India and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks in the Southern States of America, they were, in a sense, the models of non-violent politics. It's civil disobedience. So you're very polite, but you do not cooperate. All right? And you do not cooperate in a way that you cause disruption. And you may get arrested or you may get vilified, but you take it without responding. But you say, I'm staying here because of this cause in which I believe. And it is a cause about global justice. It is about justice. It's about sticking up. I mean, you think about it, the burning of all the fossil fuels has been done by the industrialised countries. Those who are going to suffer most are the marginalised, and those who live in the fragile areas of this planet. So non-violence is really, really important, and particularly this week, just after Hong Kong riots have become violent, it's the Hong Kong protests have become violent. It really has changed the whole thing there, and it is hugely important to stay non-violent. And so it's civil disobedience, and the theory is that there reaches a tipping point that if enough people are civilly disobedient, government has to listen because the system gets clogged up. There are too many people sitting in the jails waiting to go to court. The courts are overwhelmed with people being done for obstruction. Modest fine, but it still takes out hours and hours of court time. And that data gets fed back as well into government to say, well, people really are anxious about this, we'll have to look at it and do something about it. And the theory is that if 4% of the population are involved in civil disobedience, they will do something. 4%. So it's not that many. 2 million.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. It's actually not many people.
No.
And actually, because I remember earlier on in the presentation you were talking about people getting arrested. I think there's a special term for it.
You volunteer to be an arrestable.
Arrestable, yeah.
Yeah, you're an arrestable. There are players in this country. Remember, we're talking about Britain, where we have a pretty open democracy and a pretty clear way of managing the right that everybody has to protest. But if you're causing an obstruction, the police can say, move on. And if you refuse to move, then you can be arrested. Or they can, at times of stress, bring in what's called a Section 14, which says no protests allowed, you're not allowed to obstruct, you just do as you're told. But that is only used in very special occasions. And this recent event in London, recent action in London, the police brought a Section 14 across the whole of the city of Westminster, and it was found to be illegal by the court subsequently. But for every person who volunteers to be an arrestable, there needs to be at least 20 other XR people who are not going to be arrested. And it's something that you choose to be. I was actually on the arrestables list, but I'm going to do a job next year working with the High Sheriff of Herefordshire. And the High Sheriff is the Queen's representative of justice. So we decided it would not be a good thing for
Probably not the best.
you know, it would be okay, but it might embarrass the High Sheriff, and causing embarrassment to the High Sheriff is like causing embarrassment to the Queen. You don't do it. I don't mind causing embarrassment to an elected member of Parliament, but not to the Sovereign.
I'm quite interested actually in the logic behind the arrestables, because you're saying it places pressure on the courts, which then gets fed up to government.
That's right.
Could you...
Right, okay, so
please?
government has to have statistics. It needs hard facts before it changes stuff, okay? So a whole load of people saying climate crisis is coming, it's really bad, they don't need to listen to it. They don't, because they haven't so far. But if a huge amount of police time is used in looking after London because it's been clogged up and made dysfunction, can't function because of all these XR protesters, they all put in their report, and they put in their report to say it costs £32 million for the 2 weeks of the XR protest in London, all right?
Yeah.
Then it goes through the courts, and I don't know what the a cost of putting somebody through court is, but it's a lot of hours, and all those statistics are logged as well. And so whether you go to magistrate court or go to Crown Court, that all gets fed into government statistics via the Ministry of Justice. So then people start to realise, the decision makers start to realise, this is a serious matter and we need to give it attention. Right? Because at the moment, it's being given lip service. It hasn't been given serious attention.
Yeah, that's very true. So moving on to the next question, actually, that's taking us a little bit out of the previous one, is sort of what is meant by climate emergency? So it's a phrase quite often heard.
Okay.
What does it exactly mean?
Okay, we used to talk about climate change. We knew that the climate of this planet was heating up, all right? We've actually known it would heat up since the 1850s, when the chemists worked out that as CO2 parts per million increased in the atmosphere, the CO2 acts as a greenhouse gas. It traps the warmth inside the atmosphere and it can't radiate out back to space, all right? And as the Industrial Revolution happened, there were scientists in the 1850s saying, well, if we burn lots of fossil fuels, we'll heat up the planet. And they actually started recording it. But nobody really took any notice of it. In the early 80s, 70s and 80s, the sort of natural scientists were noticing climate change. They were seeing that the seasons were changing, the weather was behaving erratically. There was stuff going on to do with the climate, and it was shifting. I was out in Kenya in the early 80s, and an area which I knew from my childhood when I lived in Uganda, which used to be as dry as a bone, was getting rain. And another area was getting rain every week, whereas they used to have rain 3 months of the year. And then there were other parts of East Africa which were getting drier. So stuff was on the shift. Then the scientists in the 70s, 80s, they were saying there is climate change going on, and there was an intergovernmental committee on climate change set up by the UN in 1990 because it was recognised as a reality. The climate of the planet was changing, and it was being posited by the scientists then that this was to do with CO2, carbon dioxide, parts per million. Before the Industrial Revolution, parts per million of CO2 were in about 240 parts per million in the atmosphere, all right? Halfway through the Industrial Revolution, they're up to about 350 parts per million. They're now running, I think it's at 420 parts per million, and this is having an effect on the climate. and it is causing the planet to heat up. It's becoming a crisis because in the last few years, literally the last 5 years, they've seen that the polar ice caps and the glacial mountains are melting far faster than they thought it was going to happen. And they realise that this is moving out of control. So it isn't climate change, it's a climate crisis. And the worry is that if we don't get the maximum temperature rise below 1.5 centigrade, global temperature rise, below 1.5 centigrade, the melt of the polar ice caps will absolutely exacerbate a tipping point. Sea levels rise, the planet will warm very, very fast. Vast amounts of methane are going to be released into the atmosphere as well. Methane is a much more serious but short-term warming gas than CO2. CO2, hangs around in the atmosphere for decades, but it's slow. Methane is fast, but then it decays. But that's why we're in a crisis, because it's bloody serious.
Yeah.
It is really, really serious. And we're seeing this in the weather changes, the extreme storms, the floods, the droughts, the massive heating up forest fires. It is really,
the recent incidents with koalas in Australia.
Yeah, Australia and California, the forest fires, the terrible typhoon storms and surges, it is really, really serious.
So actually kind of moving on to the criticism, well not criticisms, but I guess more of the sort of interrogating questions.
Yeah.
I think, you were talking about this earlier, which is about, appealing to more kind of low income. And a criticism I often hear about Extinction Rebellion is that it consists of very middle class, white kind of people. So how would you manage to basically appeal to those?
Right.
That demographic certainly matters. How would you appeal to them?
It does matter. I think what we've got in XR are people who have got time.
Yeah.
So a lot of retired people, like me, fair number of academics, people who are, in a sense, income secure, who can take 2 weeks to go and do something. And we're not attracting those whose lives are tough and they're surviving, who might be doing 2 or 3 jobs, whose lives are difficult, whose whole income is going just pay the rent and buy enough food. And those are, in a sense, the people who we need to attract for their support, but I don't think we can attract to get them to commit huge amounts of volunteer time to this sort of organisation. And certainly, I would say they're not the sort of people who should be putting themselves forward to be arrested. They really aren't. And sad to say, particularly if they're black, Asian, or in any way different from white middle class, because I reckon their treatment would be very, very different in a police station than if it was me being arrested. Yeah. And I'm sorry to say that, but I think that would happen.
Yeah.
My commitment, though, is to get the message out beyond the hippie fringe, which is one bit of it, and beyond those who are retired in time. I mean, I'm doing this thing, trying to get into the WIs, the Women's Institutes, which is a massive women's movement in this country. Although it's seen as Jam in Jerusalem, it actually has a huge amount of influence. And we've got to get it out into all sorts of local areas. But because it's an issue which has been, in a sense, marginalised by government for a long time, and because it's an issue that's in the too difficult box to deal with, it's not very popular. Because it demands quite a lifestyle change, I think, as well. We have to consume less. We really do. And we have got to be far, far more careful in the amount of fossil fuel we consume. Now, some of that we have a choice over. Do we fly? Do we drive? What sort of car? But some of it we have no choice over. Our electricity is generated in power stations which burn fossil fuels. We can switch suppliers if we can afford it, but there are all sorts of lifestyle choices. And so I think we have to be hugely encouraging about how to help people make those lifestyle choices. But of course, against that is a machine of the capitalist economy, which is oil-based, which wants to burn fossil fuel. That's what drives it. And that's why you could say that the fuel lobby, the fossil fuel lobby, has been so hard against addressing climate crisis.
Yeah. How would you appeal to people in that sort of area, that kind of demographic? Or have there been attempts to?
There have been attempts. One thing is that shareholders will eventually possibly demand of the companies in which they've invested a shift. The way I often have done it is actually to talk to people about their experience. Now, it depends how protected you are, because if you have lots of money, you can live a pretty protected lifestyle from the extremes of climate change.
Yes.
But, some of the ways is to talk to them about their memories. One of the things I found fascinating is that when I was a kid, the air was full of insects. My grandchildren don't know air full of insects. They have disappeared. And that's partly to do with the climate change, it's partly to do with the way we farm, the amount of pesticides and chemicals we've been using. We are destroying this planet. And so one of the things you can do is talk to people about what they remember and how they've seen it shift. I don't know how we're going to get the shift, because the interests of big mega money is just to use the Earth's resources as if they're always going to be there, and they're not. I hope many of them have got a house in Venice. It's a very fashionable place to have a palace, because the way we're carrying on, their house in Venice, their palace in Venice won't be usable in 10 years. That's the problem. It's only when it begins to bite that people do something about it.
Which is often when it's too late.
Which is definitely when it's too late. Definitely. In my bleaker moments, I do think that we've probably got 4 generations left on this planet before we've started to destroy it to such an extent that the population of the world will begin to reduce considerably. And that's awful to think about.
Yeah, definitely.
But we're too clever by half. And we haven't done anything about solving the problem that we created with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is great. It enables us to sit in this room and do this. But there's been a cost that we have not really got our heads around.
Do you think one way of, I did ask this before, but one way of trying to appeal to other people, or try to actually have more power in the governmental sphere, is to have a citizens' assembly and try to appeal that way, or even try to reach out to organisations that potentially would support that?
I think we've got to have a citizens' assembly. We have what is called a representative democracy.
Yeah.
But I would say I don't feel represented at all by my MP. And that is the experience of many people.
Yeah.
So it works and it doesn't work. It works because it enables strong governments to be formed, even though they only have 35% of the vote. It works because it allows the administration to carry on. But actually, in terms of representing the people of this country, it doesn't. And so that's where a citizens' assembly would be hugely useful. There are lots of ways it could be done. It could be given legislative power, or it could be that there is a promise by government, a real commitment, a legislative commitment, to listen and act on what the citizens' assemblies agree and find. But at least you would be involving lots of people in discussing the problem and thinking ways to get out of it. Because when people actually understand that, burning fossil fuels is the problem, then they might say, well, we've got to find another way of generating electricity and another way of travelling and another way of doing all the things that we want to do without burning fossil fuels. And we know that there are loads of ways to do it, but we haven't had the commitment. Look at what central government does. We put millions into road transport, into vehicles, into diesel-powered vehicles, and we put a tiny percentage into green technologies and different forms of transport. It's what we, what our governments choose to do with our money. And at the moment, they choose not to really invest in a green agenda. So if we had lots of people in Citizen Assembly saying we've got to invest in a green agenda, then maybe they'd bloody well get round to doing it. Excuse me, I'm French, it's not very French, but, I get frustrated, and that's one of the problems. You do get frustrated.
Do you have some, influential people within it? I mean, of course there is, I saw, but, in Extinction Rebellion, are there, lobbyists, for example?
Well, then, you see, I don't even know who's in it,
yeah, that's
you
true,
see, because there's no membership list.
Yeah.
I know some people who are in Extinction Rebellion who I think are quite influential.
Yeah.
I don't know how much effect they're managing to have.
Yeah.
And, it's really interesting. Boris Johnson's dad is a member of Extinction Rebellion.
Really?
Yes. He was on the actions.
Oh, that's
He's
crazy.
been part of the European, when he was an MEP, part of the European climate change group. He says it's really serious.
Yeah.
But his son's not listening to him very much.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's sort of an effect of populism as well.
Yes, I think so. Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, he knows how serious. He was in New Zealand this week saying we've only got a matter of 2 decades. He knows how serious it is. Because of the protocols in this country, he cannot be an open member of XR, but I wish he was. We do need, and we have some big things, but I think XR is too politically dangerous for those who need to stay in the status quo.
Yeah.
It's not a dangerous organisation at all.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah. It's definitely tricky if you have political power, because you do have to be appealing to the masses.
Yeah.
And not even just the masses.
And that's why we've got to get the message across, and that's why they're saying we need to tell people the truth about the size of the climate crisis. If you think about David Attenborough being very careful on all his Planet Earth programmes about climate change, always brought it in, but he's been very careful not to cause trouble. And then inadvertently, not with climate change, he caused trouble by plastic in the oceans. When they discovered and were filming and saw how much plastic there was. And there is a huge hue and cry about plastic in the oceans, and that part of the Pacific where there's this vast raft of plastic circulating around in the currents. Now, maybe David Attenborough, before he gets too old to constantly be narrating programmes, has got to get a little more vehement. He'll probably be shut down by the BBC, he'll have to move to Channel 4, which is more marginal. But we do need some serious influences to say how bad it is.
Okay. Yeah, definitely agree. One last question. Because
I could go on all night. As you know, these guys want there too.
This is just to do with the demand of Extinction Rebellion. A few of the demands. So one of them is that the government enact legally binding policy measures to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2025. Could this be deemed quite impractical? Because of that,
it could be deemed impractical by some people.
Yeah.
The reason it's 2025 is we've got to do something about it quick, when we've been doing nothing about it for 20 plus years. Okay? And 2025 means that we're secure in not reaching the tipping point. 2030 we might actually be at the tipping point. That's the worry. And at the moment, our fossil fuel consumption and CO2 production is going up. So that's why 2025 is there. Now, it could be impractical, but if we had a massive change in our lifestyle because we are in a crisis, then we possibly could do something about it, and we could achieve it. Mm-hmm. Getting our electrical power fossil-free by 2025 will be very, very difficult because we're dithered and not invested enough in renewable electricity sources in this country. We could buy some more electricity from Norway and other parts of Scandinavia where they have big hydro systems. What about road transport? Yeah, we've put everything on the roads because we thought that was the best thing to do back in the 60s. And we've lost the infrastructure of rail transport that we need. And how are we going to fix it? I don't know, but if we don't try, we'll never get there. Because we're seeing we've been doing something about it since 1990. And you only have to look at the statistics and see we've achieved absolutely nothing in terms of reducing CO2 parts per million and reducing the burning of fossil fuels.
Okay, well thank you very much. That's all we have time for, unfortunately, but thank you very much. It's been a delight. Thank you.
Okay.